Bulgaria's newly appointed government intends to end military aid deliveries to Ukraine, Defense Minister Dmitry Stoyanov said. The move reflects the position of Prime Minister Rumen Radev, who argues the war cannot be won on the battlefield. So a bit of context, the Bulgarian elections just happened a couple months ago at the end of April. The party Progressive Bulgaria won the majority of votes. They got 44.6% of the vote and around 130 of the 240 seats in parliament. They have a proportional parliamentary system, so roughly the number of votes that they'll get in the election will translate to how many seats in parliament that they have. This is the first time since 1997 that they've had a one-party rule in Bulgaria. Does that mean that the one party has complete control over everything? Well, not necessarily, but it is the first time that they have a majority inside the parliament, just one single party. So if they get their stuff together, if they get the coalition together properly, they can pass almost any legislation that they want to. Bulgaria's newly appointed government plans to halt weapons deliveries to Ukraine, potentially disrupting the flow of Soviet-caliber ammunition to Kiev from one of the few remaining EU suppliers. So post the Cold War, when Bulgaria really broke off, stopped becoming a satellite state and kind of really gained their own sovereignty and independence, they also in the process inherited a lot of the Soviet Union's Soviet era ammunition production factories and industrial facilities. And so they still have those that are still operating. And that is where a lot of Ukraine's more rudimentary, basic, and arguably archaic ammunition and artillery and ordnance and whatnot is manufactured. A lot of Ukraine's military systems and weapons and all that stuff are still, if not directly from the Soviet era, are heavily modeled off of it and rely on that kind of those types of ammunition to be used in it. Even though over time and as the war has gone on, they've modernized more and more as a lot of those supplies have dried up. A lot of those old tanks and stuff like that have been destroyed. And as more new equipment has been donated and purchased from places like the US, the UK, and other members of the EU. Bulgarian Defense Minister Dimitar Stoyanov told reporters in Sofia on Tuesday that his government believes further arms shipments would not help bring an end to the war. I guess I understand what they're saying, right? I guess the point they're trying to make is that it's a stalemate. Clearly the war between the Ukraine and Russia has turned into a complete stalemate as far as actual territorial gains and the war itself. But does that mean that the arms shipments are pointless and won't help bring an end to the war? I don't know about that, right? At this point, it's clearly just a war of attrition. You could argue that on one hand, Ukraine is a smaller player. They have less reserves to draw from, both in terms of resources and manpower, that eventually they'll hit a bottleneck on that and that they will be the ones to lose the war of attrition in that regard. But then you can also argue that, in the sense that Russia is sort of a house of cards, that their house of cards is much bigger. They have much more to lose. There's much more that can kind of collapse in on itself. And so you could argue that the war of attrition itself, especially since they aren't getting as much outside support as Ukraine is from the US, UK, the EU, other nations, right? Russia doesn't really getting that same kind of support from abroad. And so they are experiencing internally directly more attrition, on a month by month basis. I'm pretty sure statistics are showing that they're losing somewhere around 30 to 40,000 troops per month, but they're only able to recruit something like 20 to 25, and that is slowly dwindling and slowly knocking down their total supply of troops and whatnot. So there's kind of an argument to be had on both sides about who's kind of winning this war of attrition and who can really hold out the longest. So in that sense, I don't know if I would agree. If you could make the case to me that the Ukraine is the one that is going to lose the war of attrition in the long run, if it lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 more years, that they are definitely going to lose, and there's no way Russia is going to lose that in that scenario, then I could maybe argue, okay, further arms shipments is not going to help bring an end to the war. But that case has not been made to me, and I could see an argument for either side. Ukraine needs more people, not more armament, Stoyanov said during a briefing in the Bulgarian capital, according to Bloomberg. He called for a just peace to be determined by both sides in the conflict. I kind of talked about this in another story I covered about Russia and Ukraine, but I don't think Russia is just going to concede. I don't think they're going to end the war with some small land concessions on the part of Ukraine, right? They've sunk over 1 million men have been died or have been suffered casualties in this war on their side. They've dumped a tremendous amount of resources. The country has gone in a tremendous amount of debt. They've experienced quite a high inflation over the last however many years. The economy's taken a huge hit. They've economically isolated themselves from like the EU. They no longer have very many trade partners in the EU and from all over the world and from the US, and there's trade embargoes and trade blockades and things like that. Like I don't see any reason why that like they would come to that sort of agreement, right? I imagine that the kind of concessions they would want from Ukraine would also on their side make it kind of pointless to go ahead with it, kind of pointless to agree with a ceasefire at this point, right? Ukraine has lost a tremendous amount of manpower. They've lost a lot of people. I don't know if they've lost 500,000 plus, maybe close to 1 million people have suffered casualties in the war on the Ukrainian side, as well as the economy has been completely transformed into a wartime economy. And, you know, if there was going to be that sort of agreement, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't have happened 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? I imagine that the kind of terms that Russia would want for a ceasefire for the ending of the war, Ukraine would not be okay with, and vice versa. The kind of terms that Ukraine would want for a ceasefire at this point, Russia is not going to agree for. And so I just don't. What does he mean by a just peace? Like this parliament and the current prime minister, and I've heard them described as the most Moscow friendly of all of the EU. And so in that sense, I have a feeling that when he says he called for a just peace to be determined by both sides in this conflict, he really means like one that probably favors Russia and Moscow. And they're probably the types of people to argue like, you know, they're the bigger player. They can hold out longer than you. Like Ukraine, you're going to have to make concessions and yada, yada. I have a feeling that that's probably where their head's at. The announcement aligns with the position of Prime Minister Rumen Radev, who took office in May after previously serving as Bulgaria's president until January. Radev's Progressive Bulgaria won by a landslide in April's parliamentary elections. My understanding is that Progressive Bulgaria, typically like in the US and a lot of other parts of the Western world, the term progressive means like quite a left or fairly far left. But like as far as I understand, the Progressive Bulgaria Party is much more centrist-y, like center left, but has like strong nationalist elements. They're very much like Bulgaria first. I know that's kind of one of the slogans that they go with, that they run on. As far as I understand, they're mostly in favor of being in the EU, and they don't have any like desire to pull out of the EU like the far right parties do, but they are skeptical at least of some of the EU policies and some of the things that the EU leads the charge on. And so, you know, it's not when you see Progressive Bulgaria, that does not mean left wing. It's kind of a bit more complicated than that. They're probably center left nationalist. That's probably the best way to put them. Radev has repeatedly argued that the war cannot be resolved on the battlefield and has criticized European military support for Kiev. Yeah, of course he has, because he's like the most Moscow, Putin, Russia friendly like EU member by far. And so like there's probably some serious questions about like the kind of connections that they have there. Like I wonder if maybe in some roundabout way, like the Kremlin and Putin and Russia and whatnot support Radev and the Progressive Bulgarian Party because they know how sympathetic they are to the Russian side. So I don't know any specific examples off the top of my head to like make that claim, but it would not surprise me one bit if I saw that. Bulgaria is one of the EU's largest producers of Soviet standard ammunition, including artillery shells compatible with many of the systems still used by Ukrainian forces. Yeah, like I said, a lot of the like more rudimentary like mortars and artillery systems that they use in Ukraine and the Ukrainian military are like either legitimately just straight up surplus from the Cold War era, or are like newly manufactured, but they use these Soviet standard ammunition. Like it's just, when you say Soviet standard ammunition, it's really just like a different sizing, right? Like I know like 5.56 ammunition, like NATO style, is like, they're very similar bullets as like the 7.62, like the typical equivalent for the Soviet standard size, but they're just like slightly different diameters and lengths and whatnot. And obviously they can only be used in their respective types of operating systems or guns or mortar systems or artillery launchers or whatever. Although Sofia initially resisted direct military assistance after Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Bulgarian-made ammunition reached Ukraine through exports to other European countries. My understanding is that like a lot of its ammunition coming from Bulgaria to Ukraine, some of it is in the form of aid packages and like donations, and they're free in that regard. But a lot of it, as far as I understand, is literally just being purchased, right? Which helps the Bulgarian economy. So like, I wonder if what they're talking about here for wanting to end Bulgarian support, I'm assuming that they're referring to like the free cash injections, the free donations of military equipment, and those kind of things. They're not talking about like cutting off Ukraine's ability to purchase it from them, which at least is a good chunk, if not a complete majority, of the types of ammunition that they're receiving from Bulgaria currently. Since then, Bulgaria has approved 13 military aid packages for Kiev, though authorities have not publicly disclosed their value or contents. In 2023, the owner of a Bulgarian arms maker accused Russian intelligence of assassination attempts and sabotaging his factories, including an explosion at a depot in 2023. See, this kind of thing makes me wonder, that maybe they are wanting to cut off the ability for Ukraine to get any kind of military, equipment from Bulgaria entirely, even if they're purchasing it legitimately from manufacturers and distributors or whatever. Which really would make me think that there is some sort of weird connection between the Kremlin and this Bulgarian Progressive Party and the current prime minister, Radev. Yeah, I know Bulgaria wasn't one of the biggest donators to Ukraine. I know that the US, UK, and various other EU members by total money and by total amount of equipment has donated far more to Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that I'm sure whatever Bulgaria is donating isn't significant. And that I worry, I don't worry. I don't have too much of a suspicion that this will happen, but this could be the first domino of a bunch of others to begin falling. The war can't go on forever. These countries can't continue to provide support to Ukraine forever. Eventually, more nationalist interests inside these various EU states that are giving a lot of support to Ukraine are going to take over, are going to continue to gain power off the back of people not wanting to give their money to Ukraine in this regard, or rather preferring not to give money to Ukraine in this regard, and that maybe this could be one of the first dominoes to fall, and that other European nations might also pull out their support for Ukraine. I hope not. It's almost like a sunk cost fallacy at this point. Both the US, the UK, and a bunch of these EU states have sunk so much resources into trying to help Ukraine at this point that there's a bit of a sunk cost fallacy. You want to continue to help them so that they don't just lose, right? If they end up losing at the end of this, it kind of makes all of that support a little bit pointless. Not totally pointless, but you lose a lot of the benefit you get from it.